Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast delving into one issue that is affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Hi, Haviv.
Hey, Amanda.
Good to see you. Glad you're back in the country.
It's good to be here. I'm gone next week, but I'm just checking in that everything's still around.
So we are recording on Wednesday, which is just after President Donald Trump addressed Congress in an hour and 40-minute speech. So, Haviv, I have to admit, I didn't watch it. Did you?
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that, look, it was very long and we're all reading briefings about it, but I will eventually have to go back and watch it because there are nuances, there's choices of language, but at the moment, in the immediate aftermath of it, I have not yet caught up. It's been a busy day.
There's this amazing thing now with technology that you can listen to things at double speed. So I recommend that for this particular speech. And, you know, we are busy people. But I have to say that one thing that jumped out at me was Trump's really confident statement that he was bringing the hostages home. And we heard today, just this evening, that the Trump administration has been holding secret, direct talks with Hamas aimed at securing the release of American hostages and bringing about a permanent end to the war in Gaza. So these, again, secret talks being held by Trump's hostage envoy, Adam Boehler, are unprecedented because the U.S. has never before engaged directly with Hamas, which, incidentally, Washington designated as a terror group in 1997. So when I read about this, I asked our U.S. bureau chief, on a scale of 1 to 10, how big is it that the U.S. is holding direct talks with Hamas? And before I tell you what his number was, what would be your number, Haviv, between 1 and 10? How big do you think this is?
So I'm not 100% clear on how direct. In other words, it's the hostage emissary of the envoy of the president. He's in Doha. It's through the Qataris. Is a Hamas guy and an American guy in the room together? Probably. That apparently is the report. But the Qataris themselves are actually handling the back and forth. I would say it's a 7 because this happens in intelligence level, right? What's different here is just the publicizing of it. By the way, the Israelis have intelligence channels open to them should they need them, not with Hamas during the war underground, right, in Gaza, but there are these capabilities of communicating with each other, not just through the Egyptians or the Qataris. And so for the Americans, and the Trump administration also doesn't hold by, the way things should be done. It's just culturally doesn't feel boxed in that way. So I'm not that surprised. Why did he say it was 10?
He did not say it was 10. He, like you, had lots of but there's also, and you should also know kind of comments to give me, and he gave it an 8. So that's just kind of interesting. But I have to say,
we're a skeptical bunch, journalists.
We definitely are. But I think my eyebrows always go up a lot higher than anyone else's in the room when I hear stuff like this. So it is interesting, but perhaps not the most interesting thing in the room right now, because we also have these 2 day after plans that we're still really trying to figure out. We have, of course, the Trump plan, and then we have this week I don't know what you would call it, the ratification of Egypt's plan by the Arab leadership at the Cairo conference, something like that. And so we have these 2 plans that we're still trying to figure out. The Trump plan, of course, is the idea to make Gaza a Riviera of the Middle East. That's a little unfair, but it's essentially to rebuild from the rubble and create a Hamas-free, rebuilt, habitable Gaza Strip. But it, of course, as everyone knows, also means that all the Gazans in the Strip would have to relocate to Jordan and Egypt and undetermined elsewhere. So that, of course, has raised a lot of eyebrows, even higher than mine, I would say. Israel, to remind our listeners, has embraced the Trump plan, but it says that while Israel is committed to it, it needs to have these working groups that are actually apparently beginning to work on a plan that could somehow make this Trump proposal viable. So, Haviv, do you have any comments before we move on to the Egypt plan about the Trump plan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those who still doesn't entirely understand what it means. All the Gazans leave by force, willingly. The difference between by force and willingly is all the difference in the world. That's not minor. It's not small. Permanently, temporarily. President Trump has been asked, and he has said, no, yeah, they're going to be, forced to leave, right? But again, how? Who is actually going to force 2 million people to leave? Morally, those are very different, radically different things. So I don't entirely understand the plan. Also, who lives there if not them? Is it now Israeli? What does it mean that Trump thinks it's going to be American? I mean, America has these odd territories scattered around the world, but they're usually islands. They're usually not, it's almost like Gibraltar kind of situation. It's a very strange, unclear plan. And the way we've all interpreted it was that it was an attempt, the Israelis had come to the Trump administration and said to the Trump administration, a deep and old frustration of the Israelis, which is that the Arabs always seem to get a reset button from the international community. They always get to say, we're going to fight a war, and then the international community is going to prevent Israel from actually inflicting on us permanent damage. And therefore, it's always worth fighting a war because you could win something and you can never lose anything too much. And you can always rebuild, and the civilian suffering doesn't matter to a regime like Hamas along the way. And so Hamas needs to feel like it's going to lose something permanently, was the Israeli ask of the Trump administration, apparently, and just sort of generally is the Israeli view. And then maybe this is the Trump administration's response to that. In other words, it's a statement, dear Hamas, you could lose Gaza. Palestinians could lose Gaza. It has succeeded in the sense that it forced the Arab world to come up with a plan. Nobody in the Arab world was coming up with a plan until Trump, threw this thing in the air, and then it forced it. So maybe it's a clever thing, but it seems to also be moving forward. The Israeli government, as you said, has embraced it, but hasn't explicitly talked about what it actually means, who's actually going to do it, who's running anything. Anyway, I don't know enough to know that there's a real plan that I can now judge on the merits. I know that a lot of the rhetoric around it has very casually skirted between horrific and perfectly legitimate. We have polls of Palestinians in Gaza. 50%, according to one poll, would leave if they could. That makes sense in a place after a war. If 50% remain, that none of the Israeli, of the Israeli far right's fantasies about maybe resettling Gaza are now solved, right? It's not like 1 million Palestinians in Gaza is now empty Gaza. So I don't understand the politics around it. I do want Palestinians who want to leave to be able to. I don't think it's possible or legitimate to push Palestinians who don't want to leave out. Anyway, I just took a long time to say I'm as confused as everybody else. And maybe that's the story of the Trump administration. It's a little bit winging it, although it has managed to force the Arabs to come to the table.
Okay, so let's talk about the Arab plan. And they published it, and it's over 100 pages long, and they called it Early Recovery, Reconstruction, Development of Gaza. And essentially, the Arab plan envisions the establishment of an independent committee of Palestinian technocrats to temporarily manage Gaza before handing the strip over to the Palestinian Authority. It stresses that Palestinians will be able to remain in Gaza and rejects Trump's proposal to relocate the strip's residents. So the Egyptian document envisions a Gaza Administration Committee, which is made up of technocrats, to manage for at least 6 months, this kind of transitional phase. And it also urges elections in all Palestinian areas within a year, if conditions support a move. Let's just remind our listeners that the last elections in the Palestinian Authority were in 2005. So one of the big... 2006? Okay, I sit corrected. But Haviv, obviously, one of the major things that the plan doesn't actually tackle is the issue of Hamas and how the terror group will be disarming. And that's kind of exposed it to criticism. So there's only one kind of a veiled reference to Hamas in the plan, and it is, I quote, "Issue of multiple armed Palestinian factions can only be addressed if its root causes are tackled by providing a clear political prospect and a credible process that works to establish the Palestinian state." What do you make of that, Haviv?
Yes, what I make of that is that Trump managed to terrify the Arab world sufficiently to make them come to the table, but not sufficiently to make them actually seriously ante up and say anything useful. The idea that there's $20 billion to dump in Gaza to rebuild it, well, obviously, these are some of the economies involved are vast extraction economies. They got a lot of oil, they got a lot of money. The money for rebuilding Gaza isn't the problem. If Hamas is in charge, you cannot rebuild Gaza. A, because Hamas would funnel massive amounts of concrete and money to the next war. It has said so repeatedly from the top leadership, as often as people will let them. You let a Hamas guy near a microphone, he's going to say it again.
Oh, and by the way, he wants to still destroy Israel, just for the record.
Yeah, shocking, right? So Israel no longer wants to live next to a threat like that because it no longer trusts its own judgment about whether the enemy is deterred. And so threats can't be tolerated anymore on our borders because of the scale of the failure of October 7. And that is a really terrible thing for Gaza because it means that Hamas actually has to be extracted. Any Arab peacekeeping force that comes into Gaza now, even if Hamas is 70% destroyed, 80% destroyed, we don't know exactly, and a lot of the new recruits are 15, even if that is Hamas's situation, it is still more than powerful enough, more than secure enough in its position to harass Arab forces out of the place, to murder and massacre any Arab peacekeeping force until they have to leave, or to shoot at Israelis from Arab peacekeeping areas and prevent the Israelis from shooting back because the Israelis can't afford to kill Egyptian and Saudi soldiers. And so the plan that doesn't remove Hamas, seriously deal with Hamas, not pretend fake deal as most dictatorships usually talk, as most politicians usually talk, but actually looks at the problem squarely in the eye and says to Hamas, "Dear Hamas, can't rebuild Gaza until you're gone. Dear Hamas, Gaza can't be safe until you're gone. You've screwed up. This was a mistake. This was a vast strategic and tactical mistake. We have to clean up what we can clean up in Gaza. Gaza needs a new day. That means you're gone." Unless somebody can look at Hamas and say that, I literally don't know how it works. It doesn't even, if you think the Israelis are good or evil, none of that matters. Hamas cannot physically, literally rebuild Gaza, and it even can't be the Hezbollah of Gaza. In other words, the powerful militia force that in practice controls the area, but someone else, some technocrat, which is, by the way, by far the best kind of crat, that someone else is going to be the sort of veneer under which you operate. None of that is going to be tolerated by the Israelis, not for 50 years down the road. And so the Arabs put up a plan that is silly and ridiculous and not meant to actually be implemented. It was a shot across the bow of the political propaganda war. If Trump wants a serious Arab plan, he's going to have to put a lot more pressure on the Arabs.
It's interesting because, yes, I agree with you in principle, but at the same time, the plan actually does have some real specifics, meaning the Egyptian plan calls for Egypt and Jordan to train Palestinian police, and a draft version encouraged the examination of an international force in the West Bank and Gaza. They have actually spelled out some possibilities here, but what's even more interesting to me, actually, is that the plan apparently takes its inspiration from the reconstruction of Hiroshima and Berlin, which were, of course, cities devastated by Allied attacks in World War II, and are now obviously thriving modern cities. But as you said, the main difference here is that in these two locations, the fanatic ideology was uprooted and is still being uprooted. In the case of Germany, at least, they're obviously still working on this and making sure that it doesn't spread again. So is there even a possibility of doing something like that in this type of framework when the Gazans essentially are still in charge of the Gazans? The police will be trained by outside forces, but they will be the Palestinian police, presumably Gazan police. Doesn't that kind of make you think that perhaps they may still be the Hamas police, potentially?
There are, it's useful, I think, to compare to Lebanon. In Lebanon, the Israeli war against Hezbollah was extraordinarily successful at the beginning. Extremely successful in part because of Israeli decisions, that astonishing intelligence success of the pagers and the walkie-talkies, and also extraordinarily successful because of a series of disastrous strategic mistakes that Nasrallah himself took. For example, early on, after October 7 in the war in Gaza, even though he's pelting Israel with rockets, firing many, many, many thousands of rockets over the course of 14 or 15 months, he did give the order to the Radwan force to pull back from the border. And so when the Israeli army comes in to the south, it does a sweep of villages and doesn't meet the most entrenched forces because Nasrallah didn't want them destroyed. Well, the leadership was destroyed anyway. There were many running gun battles. There's huge airstrikes, a lot of Hezbollah's infrastructure, financial infrastructure. Iran's ability to deploy it to Syria, to Yemen, to other places is now shattered. It'll take years to rebuild. It was an extraordinary success. And then Israel immediately grabbed a ceasefire that was available, pulled out. It was a ceasefire that allows it to continue hitting Hezbollah if it violates the ceasefire, meaning arms itself, which it has done many times. So Israel continues airstrikes, but that's a very convenient ceasefire for Israel. But the war stopped. And why did the war stop? Because there's all the rest of Lebanon that doesn't want to be ruled by Iran, doesn't want to be ruled by Hezbollah. So the question you just asked and the Arab world is asking and nobody knows the answer to and nobody's willing to seriously confront is, who is all the rest of Gaza? Who is the non-Hamas Gaza? There are many Gazans who hate Hamas, but none of them have any kind of political organization whatsoever. So who do you even talk to? The Israeli army had these experiments over the last 17 months where it tried to work with just criminal organizations, smugglers, that type of thing, clans and families that were essentially criminal organizations. Hamas massacred them just for aid distribution, and Hamas massacred them. So it's not at all clear what kind of future you can have, how you uproot Hamas from Gaza. I'll just say that it is possible to degrade Hamas much further, but it'll take occupation. It'll take total military control, a essentially degradation war, which is basically kind of military whack-a-mole for a year, 2 years, 3 years. It'll be the kind of war that the Americans fought in Iraq with the Iraqis and the Kurds. It'll be the kind of war that they fought in Iraq in 2016. They fought for 5 years. It is doable, but it's a resumption of the war. It's a bad kind of war. We'll lose soldiers. It's a whole different direction. Maybe we're headed that way. The Israeli government is talking as if it's willing to do things like that. Nobody knows how to do this.
What's really interesting to me, maybe because I'm ignorant, but the United Arab Emirates sees Hamas and other Islamists as an existential threat. And the UAE wants an immediate and complete disarmament of the terror group. But other Arab countries are talking about some kind of gradual approach. It kind of sounds like all the countries are on board with Hamas disarming, but maybe less pressing them. And we're hearing from Saudi Arabia that the continued armed presence of Hamas in Gaza was a quote-unquote stumbling block because of objections from the US and Israel. So the fact that the plan doesn't necessarily overtly talk about Hamas disarming doesn't mean that there aren't voices in the milieu who really want that to happen. I guess the question is, why isn't it in the plan then?
Well, there's disagreement. The Saudis and the Emiratis see it as fundamental strategic need for Hamas to actually be defeated and to push back in general against Muslim Brotherhood ideologues and parties and factions all over the Middle East. The Qataris, who kind of belong in the Muslim Brotherhood array of parties and factions in the Middle East, are doing everything they possibly can, including at the talks for this deal, to keep Hamas in power, to keep Hamas strong, to keep Hamas from being defeated. So there is a war within Sunni Arab Islam about the future of Islam and political Islam and jihadism. And it's a fight the Israelis, don't get a say about. They don't get a seat at the table, but they do get a say in the sense that the Israelis can put a red line around Hamas. Hamas's destruction is dissolution, removal from Gaza, is the necessary precondition for Gaza ever being rebuilt. This is, I'm going to maybe say something a little controversial. This is what Israeli victory is. This is what Israeli victory looks like. There is no future for Gaza unless Hamas is removed. The Israelis have managed to build this war into that simple fact. And in the kind of war Hamas created and imposed on the Israelis, building a tunnel network 500 kilometers long in a 25-kilometer territory, right? In terms of the history of war, nothing even remotely like it has ever been done. Hamas built a battlefield in which the civilians are the fundamental strategy, civilian death and destruction. The Israelis have no way to get to Hamas other than that. They didn't do enough destruction and therefore didn't get to a lot of Hamas. I know that sounds weird to say because there's a tremendous amount of destruction and real suffering and real human cost. But Hamas set the cost for its own actual physical military destruction much higher in terms of civilian suffering, and the Israelis didn't actually do that. And so in this kind of war, the best victory available, if you're not going to actually fight to the bitter end, is the fact that as long as Hamas is there, Gaza can't be rebuilt. So Israel has Hamas trapped, and the Arabs are torn between themselves about what to do about it. My feeling is Hamas will drag this out as long as humanly possible, irrespective of Gazan suffering. It does not yet understand, even after 17 months, Israel's absolute determination not to live next to Hamas.
Yeah, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. Everything you just said there, I would have to say, of course, that part of the reason why Israel didn't destroy all the tunnels is because of the fear that the hostages, our people, were located in them. And that has to be taken into consideration as well. But what's interesting now is I think Hamas has so expertly spun this really brilliantly again, because now Israel is kind of the bad guy for rejecting the Egyptian plan, which was adopted by the Arab leaders. And Egypt's foreign minister is blasting Israel's rejection as, quote, unacceptable, describing Israeli position as stubborn and extremist, and saying there will be no peace neither to Israel or to the region without establishing an independent Palestinian state in accordance with United Nations resolutions. And again, here we are at the bad end of the public relations stick. And what is Israel to do? As you said, Israel has a red line. Another red line, I think, at least for most of the Israeli public, is there cannot be a Palestinian state at this point. And the very fact that this plan seems to be contingent upon it is also, it just seems to me that it's living in some kind of dream world.
So I think I'm reflecting the majority view among Israelis, more than the majority, the mainstream view among Israelis across a very wide swath of politics. I don't care about the global debate. Really, truly, I don't care. The world has focused in attention on Gaza that it didn't focus on any other conflict with an order of magnitude more suffering in this immediate moment and within 1,000 miles of us. I share with most Israelis the view that a lot of this is politics and not actually humanitarian feeling. Now, decent, good people watching images of dead children on their phones are having real, authentic, honest responses. But they're the only dead children they ever get to see on their phones, because this is all very deeply manipulated by algorithms and the people who own TikTok and all of that stuff. And so Israelis genuinely don't believe that the world's outrage is is authentic. I mean, so much of it is led by Muslim diasporas, where in so many of these protests you have in Europe especially, a lot of Muslim discourse about Jews comes out, and a lot of anti-Semitism comes out, and it's led by radical left ideologues who are anti-Zionist. In other words, the last living Jew in the Eastern Hemisphere should not exist. Israelis don't care about these people or these ideas, and certainly Israelis don't care about what the Egyptian foreign minister says. Egypt is essentially a failed state that is in free fall right now economically. It's radicalizing religiously, and it's led by a corrupt military dictatorship that is profoundly weak and driving the economy into the dust. It can barely feed its 120 million population, and it pretends to be ready to go to war with Israel just to show them that the regime itself is still strong. A country that is radicalizing to the point where 80% of Egyptian girls now undergo female genital mutilation is not a country that can come to Israel and pretend to be competent enough for the Israelis to take seriously their moral objections over Gaza. He ranted. And all of that is to say, it doesn't matter what the Egyptians rattle on about the PR war. They're not serious about getting rid of Hamas. Here's the thing. If Hamas were actually defeated now, if Hamas were actually destroyed now, we've talked a lot over the past 17 months, and one of the things we've talked about is my own complaint that Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't been aggressive enough in prosecuting the war against Hamas. If Hamas were defeated now, then it would matter that the Arabs come to the Israelis and say, the Palestinians need a future, the Palestinians need a new day and a new dawn. But Hamas is still there. And if we pull out of the West Bank, any part of the West Bank, it'll be immediately filled by Hamas and nobody else, and nobody pretends otherwise. So what are we talking about?
Well, I disagree with you about that statement, because I think there are some who are pretending otherwise, and that includes Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, who was at this Egyptian conference, and he welcomed the plan. We have to remind our listeners that he's 89 years old, and he's been in power for 20 years since the last election. And he said that he's ready to hold elections about this and have presidential and parliamentary elections if circumstances allow, asserting that the PA is the only legitimate governing and military force in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, Haviv, I don't know if you read the piece written by our U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid, who spoke with a senior Palestinian official and a confidant of Abbas, who said, relating to the Trump proposal, that if Donald Trump advances his proposal to take over the Gaza Strip and relocate all the residents, get ready for this.
Okay, I'm holding on.
Okay, hold on. The Palestinian Authority will cut all ties from the Trump administration, cut all ties with the U.S. And I know the U.S. is quaking in its boots at this threat too. So there are those who at least pretend that the Palestinian Authority is some kind of major player and could be some kind of decisive voice here.
Well, Mazel Tov to Mahmoud Abbas. I am glad to hear he found his voice. He's been mostly silent for 17 months. Look, it's funny because it's ridiculous. But there's a tragedy behind the ridiculousness, because it's really a demonstration of how little other politics there are in Palestinian political life. At the end of the day, engaging Israeli society and Israeli politics, being able to come to the Israelis and say a Palestinian state is not going to mean October 7, the West Bank, is 16 times the size of Gaza. It's the highlands that overlook 90% of our population. And you can literally shoot Tel Aviv from a weapon you carry on your shoulder, like an 88 millimeter mortar, standing on the West Bank, and then just shoot and walk away. I mean, it is phenomenally more threatening geographically. It narrows the country to 8 miles wide. Would America narrow itself to 8 miles wide in the middle for the freedom of another people, for justice, for peace, for joy, for happiness, for love? It is a serious point. The Israelis actually have to think it's possible. They haven't thought it's possible since the major peace process of the 90s ended in 140 suicide bombings emerging from the places the Israeli army had left in the Oslo process. So the fact that there is no other Palestinian politics of any seriousness other than Hamas which Mahmoud Abbas has demonstrated to us and insists on continuing to demonstrate day and night, the PA doesn't even, it barely controls Ramallah. It doesn't even control most of the Palestinian population centers of the West Bank that are technically under its jurisdiction. The fact that there's no other real serious Palestinian politics other than Hamas is the great Palestinian tragedy of this moment. And because the Palestinian tragedy is part of the Israeli struggle of this moment and tragedy, also has knock-on effects for us. So it's funny, it's ridiculous, and it's sad and tragic.
So, Haviv, why the farce of this Egyptian plan, of this Arab leaders' plan? Why even go through the motions here?
The Arabs have sat quiet and helpless for the entirety of this war, and motionless. Qatar has been useful only because Qatar is Hamas, ideologically and politically. It has engaged with Hamas, it has supported Hamas, it has propped up Hamas, so it's a useful go-between. But other than that, who has said anything? Who has done anything? And so now that Trump comes in and actually threatens with Gaza actually emptying with a total Israeli victory to a point where it's a little bit startling that even this would be something coming out of an American president. It would be startling coming out of an Israeli prime minister, never mind an American president. Benjamin Netanyahu's face when Trump stood next to him and announced that in that press conference was something every Israeli was watching. We know he was expecting Trump to say something about potentially. It's something you kind of get as a hint from talking to people who talk to him. That he was expecting Trump to say something about permanent costs to the Palestinians, about Gaza, about Hamas, about the day after, about America moving in, about Hamas moving out, about allowing the borders to open. But the idea of building that, essentially Riviera, you said it as a joke. Trump has taken that joke much farther than you have. He put out a video of a gold statue of himself in a resort version of Gaza. He's trolling. Now, is he trolling and also plans to do it? Possibly. We don't know, right? But Netanyahu himself was surprised by it. So the Arabs are suddenly caught with what is essentially a radical escalation by the Americans of internal Arab political discourse about Gaza, and they have to show they're doing something. So they came up with some random garbage, idiotic thing to do that solves nobody's problems, but they probably believe covers their posteriors for the purpose of being able to say that they've done something for Gaza. Here's something you can do for Gaza that'll actually matter. Get rid of Hamas. Or don't pretend you care about Gaza. If you genuinely think a genocide is happening in Gaza, which Egypt claims officially is underway, and you lock the people in to the place you think the genocide is happening, then either you support the genocide or you don't believe it's a genocide. So the Arabs have tried to play all angles and all sides, and the last thing they care about is the actual suffering of actual Gazans. And Hamas cannot be allowed to rule Gaza going forward. Any Israeli prime minister who gives up on that will be gone and replaced by an Israeli prime minister who won't give up on that. So you want to do something for Gaza? We know the Arabs are serious the day they come up with a plan in which Hamas is gone. Until that day, it's as we say in Hebrew, posterior covering, and a response to the politics of Trump, not the substance of anything happening on the ground in Gaza, and we don't have to take it seriously.
Haviv, thank you as usual for joining me.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another episode next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.